actually. If you have any idea where Bangladesh is, it's completely opposite to United States. Now it is 10:30 here at night. So it's exactly same time in United States. So you are 10:30 in the morning. Here it is 10:30 at night. So it's the same time, just day and night difference. So just to give you an idea, and I may have internet issues. So if we get disconnected for any reason, hopefully it will not. But if anything like that happen, then I will review the content of this class again, in the next class. Okay, so that is the disclaimer that I want to make at the beginning. And so now tell me what was your experience with the exam? The exam was okay? So you can all mute and speak out. The exam was okay. The facial expression is a bit confusing these days, So you think you are okay? The exam was okay? Reasonable? Good. So let's start, because I don't know how long we can continue when the problem with internet will start. So now our plan is to talk about the basal ganglia today. I mentioned basal ganglia at the beginning, during the introduction of the fundamentals of motor system, is that I said when an action you decide to do something, those decisions are made in the frontal cortex, okay? In the frontal cortex, and from there, you see those planning, they to take place in the premotor area and supplementary motor area, depending on what type of movement or what type of motor action it is, okay? Now, to execute this function, ultimately the final execution of any motor activity is done through the primary motor area. Okay, so final pathway that began in the primary motor area or the pre-central gyrus. Okay, but you cannot do things properly if you have only premotor cortex. But if you have the whole premotor cortex intact, you will not suffer from any paralysis of any muscle, because the final pathway that travels to the muscle that arises from the motor area. Okay, but then what is the basal ganglia or cerebellum they are doing? They do some adjustments. The cerebellum is more about adjustment. We will not talk about cerebellum today. Today's focus will be on basal ganglia, and the basal ganglia is something which plans and make the what will be the appropriate way of saying it? It's the programming and the computation, the planning, and the sequence of the movements, they are all planned in the motor area. So any abstract thought of a motor movement that come to your mind, they are programmed, or they are programmed mainly in the basal ganglia. So basal ganglia, without basal ganglia signal, you cannot do things in a way which is sequential. That will be a meaningful movement. Like you all know about, I don't know whether any of you have seen a Parkinson's patient. You see the tremor that you see in Parkinson's patient, or the beginning, to initiate movement, or when the movement starts, they are jerky sometimes, they are a different type of complication, but that is the problem of Parkinson. So if you see in Parkinson patient, not a single muscle will be paralyzed. Muscle will all be working fine. Okay, none of your muscles will be paralyzed, but their action will be erratic. Okay, so sometimes they will do too much, because normally when I am sitting at rest, my hands should be like this, right? But a Parkinson patient will be like this. So they will have, which means motor area is doing too much. That's why there are areas, supplementary areas, which control the function of the motor area, which send the motor area about the programming, the sequence of an event. And not only it's only the prime mover muscle, the muscle that is doing the main action, but it's all about the background thing. Like when you write, you think of only the muscle of the hand and maybe 2 fingers, 3 fingers, something like that. But in addition to these 3 fingers, 4 fingers, you see there is a change in the tone in the wrist. You'll see the change in tone in the forearm. You see change in tone in the arm, and then you see the adjustment of the shoulder joint as well. So those background things and the planning and programming and sequence of the events, they are controlled by the basal ganglia. They compute those things and send signal, appropriate signal to the motor area so that motor area can execute the plan. Okay. So let's see if you guys are okay. Can I start sharing my screen? All okay. Okay, good. So let me start sharing, and if I share this one. Okay. So this is, so anyway, basal ganglia, this is not something we need. Huh? Okay. So looking at this image, do you have any idea which area of the brain it is? Can you identify any structure in this section that looks familiar? Anyone, any part, any structure? Can you tell me what this area is? And if you know which area is this, then if you can tell me which tract will originate from this one. This is a midbrain actually. Let me make it a little easier for you. This is the midbrain section. On the midbrain, so this is the red nucleus. So which tract began at the red nucleus? Which tract? This is a rubrospinal, right? A rubrospinal tract. Now, rubrospinal, and then this is superior colliculus, right? This area is the tectum. So the tract that began from the tectum and goes to the spinal cord, they are called tectospinal tract, right? Tectospinal tract. And this is the crus cerebri. And the location of the pyramidal tract or the corticospinal tract will be this area, right? It doesn't occupy the most medial area. It doesn't occupy the most lateral area. The middle part of the crus cerebri contain the fibers from the corticospinal tract. So this area is very, very important. We'll talk more about this area again in the future lectures. Now, let's get back to. I may not do I may make this class a little shorter actually, so that I can finish early. So you see here actually this image will show you the parts components of the basal ganglia. Now, if you see this is the cerebral hemisphere, and you make a section around here, so you can see it's right underneath the cerebral cortex, right? So this is the horizontal section in the cerebral hemisphere and the diencephalon. The base is called the diencephalon, which include the thalamus, hypothalamus, those areas. So if you make a section at that level, then you will see these very important structures. Okay. So this structure is called caudate nucleus. Okay. And this area is called putamen. Putamen and caudate nucleus, these two structures together, they are called striatum. Striatum will be something very important, okay? So striatum, which include caudate nucleus and putamen, and then putamen and globus pallidus. Putamen here, and this area is called the globus pallidus. Globus pallidus, they call putamen and putamen and globus pallidus, they are together called lenticular nucleus, okay? Lenticular nucleus. Now, globus pallidus again is subdivided into two areas. One is called globus pallidus external segment. This one is globus pallidus internal segment. So these are in anatomy, these are the components of basal ganglia. You can say they include striatum and lenticular nucleus. Striatum include caudate nucleus and putamen, and globus lenticular nucleus include putamen and globus pallidus. Globus pallidus again is subdivided into two components, globus pallidus externum and globus pallidus internum. Okay, so these are the components. Now, functionally, there are some areas which are considered when the clinicians talk about the basal ganglia, they include two more parts which are functionally related to basal ganglia. And in some classification that used by clinicians, they include them within the components of basal ganglia. They include two nuclei, subthalamic nucleus and substantia nigra. Okay, substantia nigra, you may have heard about substantia nigra. That is very important because this secrete dopamine. And if you don't have enough dopamine secreted, then you develop Parkinson's disease. Okay. So anyway, again, the functionally related components, or you can say they are part of basal ganglia. They include subthalamic nucleus and substantia nigra. Okay, so these are the components of basal ganglia. Now, let's go back a little bit and clear up one confusion. Do you remember we used the term ganglia before? Right, like dorsal root ganglia, right? Dorsal root ganglia. Now, ganglia is what? Ganglia is a collection of nerve cell body, right? Nerve cell body, right? Now, do you remember we used another term which is very similar to ganglia, which is nucleus? Do you remember that? Now, we said at the beginning, we said nucleus is collection of cell body within the central nervous system, and ganglia is collection of cell body outside the nervous system, central nervous system, right? Now, these are the collection of cell bodies, gray matter. Their basal ganglia's location is in central nervous system, right? It's right in the brain, in the base of the brain. But this is a bit confusing, right? We are calling it ganglia. We should have called it basal nucleus, right? Because collection of cell body in the central nervous system should be nucleus, not ganglia. When we say ganglia, we mean collection of cell body outside the central nervous system, which is in the periphery. Like one very common, simple example is dorsal root ganglia. Okay. Anyway, so these are the components of the basal ganglia. Now, let's look at the connection. The connection of the basal ganglia is absolutely important. So, a few connections that I want to show you. One, look at the input that basal. See, these are all components of basal ganglia. Okay, these are all components of basal ganglia. Look at this one: striatum, globus pallidus externum, globus pallidus internum, subthalamic nucleus. This is called the subthalamic nucleus. Not subthalamic nucleus. This is the you see this part here. Let me make it clear to you. Subthalamic nucleus and substantia nigra, right? Now, if I come back here, now look at this one. This is striatum, globus pallidus, subthalamic nucleus, globus pallidus internum, and this is the substantia nigra. Now, substantia nigra have two parts. We say substantia nigra parts reticulata and substantia nigra parts compacta. Okay, so dopamine is secreted by substantia nigra parts compacta. See the DA means dopamine here. Okay, now if you look at this one, so these are let me do something. It's a problem. Okay. Now, if you look at this one, so these are all components of basal ganglia, right? So these are the two things outside, main two things that are outside of basal ganglia here. One is cerebral cortex, other one is thalamus. You can you just avoid this one at this point. Don't worry about this. Just worry about thalamus and cortex. Now look at the input from cerebral cortex coming to striatum of the basal ganglia. That is a glutamatergic, so which is the glutamate is a neurotransmitter. It's a glutamatergic transmission. And another input that basal ganglia receive, both the inputs are coming into the striatum. Okay, striatum, and look at the other one is coming from thalamus. We call it corticostriatal fibers, and these are thalamostriate fibers. And now here you see there is a fiber coming from thalamus going to the cortex called thalamocortical fibers, right? We saw thalamocortical fibers before as well for all sensory tracts. We saw some fibers, they end in the thalamus, and then from thalamus they begin, another neuron begins, and that carry the information all the way to the cerebral cortex. So main input of the basal ganglia is coming from cerebral cortex and thalamus. You see, this is one input, this is another input. So basal ganglia is receiving input from cerebral cortex and thalamus, and basal ganglia through the thalamus, relay station in thalamus, connect to the cerebral cortex. Because basal ganglia, to control the motor function, it should receive information from motor area that what type of motor area the brain is intending to do, right? So that information is relayed by cerebral cortex to the basal ganglia, the striatum part of the basal ganglia, by corticostriatal fibers. They bring the information to the basal ganglia, telling the basal ganglia that this is the intention of cerebral cortex. Cerebral cortex want to do this motor function. Now, when striatum receive this information, it through the different connections to the basal ganglia. Eventually, it will relay the information to the thalamus. Now, when thalamus receives the information from the basal ganglia, depending on what type of information it received from the basal ganglia, it will feed the signal to the cerebral cortex. Okay, so that's how a motor response will be coordinated. Now, so when we are at rest, so none of our skeletal muscles are moving, right? All of them are just resting, no movement in the skeletal muscle. But if that is when that is the situation, what will happen? The the motor area of the brain will remain more or less quiet, right? Not much response coming, because little bit of response will come that will maintain the basal tone, but no real signal will come from the motor cortex for a purposeful movement of the skeletal muscle. That will not happen. So now, what normally keep the motor cortex dormant so that it doesn't keep sending signal, right? For the Parkinson's people, those who have Parkinson's disease, even when they don't intend to do anything, they still have motor. You see, they usually have tremor, which means the motor signal is going from the cerebral cortex. So that normally which is inhibited. For me, you, and any of us, we don't have any tremor in the hand. Right now, our hand is not moving. But a Parkinson's patient is different. So what is causing our cerebral cortex to remain quiet when we don't intend to do anything? Okay. Now, if you look at this one, at the signal, this normally this globus pallidus internal segment of the basal ganglia, they are continuously active. Okay. Tonically, we say they are tonically active. They are continuously keep sending signal to the hypothalamus. Okay. Now look at this one. If the globus pallidus is tonically active and keep sending signal to the thalamus, what type of signal will that be? Because when globus pallidus sends signal, it releases the GABA. GABA is gamma aminobutyric acid, right? So GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So if this one continuously sends signal from the basal ganglia, this is part of basal ganglia, right, to the thalamus, what will happen to the thalamus? Thalamus will be stimulated, or those part of thalamus will be inhibited. They will be inhibited because you are releasing GABA at the junction. So there will be either hyperpolarization or no depolarization, right? Which means the thalamus, so now at this point, the thalamus will, because thalamus is inhibited, it will not stimulate the cerebral cortex to do some motor action. So cerebral cortex will remain dormant, okay? But now, when the cerebral cortex intend to do something, now this signal is coming from cerebral cortex to the striatum. So that stimulation will be excitatory or inhibitory, because cerebral cortex, the cerebrostrial connection, what is the neurotransmitter there? That is the key. Neurotransmitter there is glutamate. If glutamate is the neurotransmitter, glutamate is an excitatory or inhibitory neurotransmitter. Glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter. So if the glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter, what will happen to the striatum? It will excite the striatum. It will stimulate the system in the striatum. Now, if the striatum is stimulated, right? So it will how striatum is connected to globus pallidus internum? Striatum is connected to globus pallidus internum, and these fibers, they release GABA at their junction. So if the GABA is released at the striatum globus pallidus internum junction, what it will do on the globus pallidus? Globus pallidus will be inhibited, right? Now, if the globus pallidus is inhibited, there will be no GABA released at this one, because globus pallidus is either hyperpolarizing or there will be no depolarization. As a result, this GABA here will not be released on the thalamus, or from the globus pallidus to thalamus. This GABA signal will be cut, right? So if this GABA signal is not there, now hypothalamus will be excited, and thalamus, actually not hypothalamus, sorry. So thalamus will then send stimulatory signal to the cerebral cortex. So cerebral cortex, then normally the basal ganglia, the inhibitory, signal that basal ganglia always send through thalamus to the cerebral cortex will be withdrawn. So now basal ganglia will be out of that inhibition. So the cerebral cortex will be out of that inhibition and cerebral cortex will start sending the signal. So normally under normal circumstances, when we are at rest, basal ganglia will always keep the motor cortex suppressed and there will be no tremor, no activity in the skeletal muscle. But when you intend to do any action, that intention is relayed from cerebral cortex to the striatum, which is a part of basal ganglia, and that part is stimulatory, right? So striatum, the part of the striatum, part of the basal ganglia, which is striatum, will now be excited, and that will cause the release of GABA on the globus pallidus. That will inhibit the globus pallidus. So if the globus pallidus is excited, it will secrete GABA, right? And that will suppress the hypothalamus. But if you can have GABA secreted at the striato-global junction, that globus pallidus at the time will be inhibited. If the globus pallidus is inhibited, there will be no GABA released at this junction. So hypothalamus, which is normally under the negative influence of GABA, will now be out of that inhibitory influence. So now thalamus will send excitatory information to the cerebral cortex. So that not only will initiate the motor response from the cerebral cortex because it will come out of the inhibition. Basal ganglia will also, you see the other part of the basal ganglia, subthalamic nucleus, globus pallidus, and substantia nigra. Those parts will all send stimulatory signal. Now look at this one. Substantia nigra part compacta that release dopamine, and dopamine can have both excitatory and inhibitory response on the striatum. Now, whether the dopamine will stimulate the striatum, will have excitatory response on striatum or inhibitory response on striatum, that will depend on what type of dopamine receptor is stimulated by that particular time. If you stimulate dopamine at dopamine D2 receptors, then it will be inhibitory on the striatum. If it is D1, it will be excitatory on the striatum. So now, when you stimulate the striatum, what will happen? It will be GABA will be released here, and this will be inhibited. That will be excitatory. But if you stimulate D2 receptors from dopamine, this will be inhibited. So if this one is inhibited, this GABA inhibition will not be there. So the globus pallidus will remain active. If the globus pallidus internam remain active, it will secrete GABA, which will inhibit thalamus. So that motor system will remain suppressed. So this basic circuit you have to understand. If you understand the basic circuit like this one, then it will not be difficult for you to see the consequence of the basal ganglia, the damage. If we have a damage to the basal ganglia. Now, again, if we summarize, if we say in one word, the function of basal ganglia, it will do the planning and programming of the motor action. So when we do a multi-sequential motor movement, all motor movements have different sequence, right? Say like walking, writing, playing piano, swimming, whatever you call. So swimming, there is for all those motor response, you have a sequence of events, right? They should happen in an orderly fashion for you to carry out a motor response. So that is the most important function of the basal ganglia. How basal ganglia does it? It receives two signals from two very important areas. One is from cerebral cortex, the other one is from the thalamus. And how the basal ganglia communicate with the cortex? Basal ganglia send signal to the thalamus, either from the globus pallidus internum or from the substantia nigra pars reticulata. And then from the thalamus is the relay station from the basal ganglia to thalamus, and from thalamus you have communication with the cerebral cortex. You see, no direct communication of the basal ganglia going to the cortex. It all goes to the thalamus. So thalamus is a very, very important relay station. Is this circuitry too complicated? It's a bit complicated. You don't have to memorize all those circuits. That's why I want you to remember at least this much. What is the basic function of basal ganglia, that you have to understand. That's why, as I mentioned before, the paralysis of the basal ganglia will not paralyze a single muscle. But if you have a damage to very small area in the cell, in the motor area, the muscle that is controlled by that particular area of the motor area will be paralyzed. But if you damage the whole basal ganglia, there will be not a single muscle, skeletal muscle, that will be paralyzed because of the damage to that particular area of the basal ganglia. But there will be no motor paralysis, but your motor activity will be grossly irregular. You see, you will lose the sequence of events. They will not, or maybe you will have, because you see, for the cerebral cortex to initiate the response, we say normally cerebral cortex is under a negative inhibitory influence, right? Now, if you are not intending to do anything, but that inhibition is removed, so the cerebral cortex will keep sending signal that will cause tremor while you are at rest. On the other hand, when you want to release that inhibition so that motor cortex can really perform motor action, if that cannot be lifted properly and communicated through the thalamus to the cerebral cortex, what will happen? You will have problem in initiating a motor response. You will see some Parkinson patient, if you ask them to walk, they are standing, they cannot just walk. They cannot be. But if you push them, and then if you push them, they start walking, and then you see they keep walking. Because so with the Parkinson disease, one of the typical example of the basal ganglia disease, damage to the basal ganglia, one is the failure to initiate a motor response. That is one thing. And when the motor response starts, its sequence will be grossly irregular. But remember, not a single muscle will be paralyzed if you completely remove the whole basal ganglia, which means these are background pairs. Ultimate, that is the key of the motor system, right? All execution of the motor action, ultimate final execution pathway will travel through corticospinal tract that arise from the cortex, right? Corticospinal. All these things, they are happening in the background that you don't realize, that you don't see. We don't see any of the function of basal ganglia. We know I can write, but yes, I can move my hand muscle, I can move all my muscle, but that muscle, that movement will be grossly irregular. They will not be meaningful because you cannot write anything meaningful. You can move your hand and you can draw something on the paper or anywhere, but that drawing will not be something. It will not be a meaningful art. To convert, so if you have an idea in your mind, an abstract idea that you want to draw something, okay, to execute that, to make that a reality, to make that happen, you really need the function of basal ganglia. Okay, did you get it?
Dr. Syed,
Go ahead.
so I apologize, but could you explain one more time how with GABA being inhibitory, it's still going to like be able to execute what you're planning?
So what GABA will, okay, let's go here. So normally we say this one, normally when we are at rest, the globus pallidus internal segment, they are tonically active. They continuously keep firing, okay? Now, if they keep firing, what will be the response? What type of neurotransmitter they will release? They will release GABA, right? Now, if they release GABA on the hypothalamus, what it will do? It is the inhibited neurotransmitter. Either it will cause the hyperpolarization of that particular nucleus of the thalamus, or it will stop the depolarization to happen because you open the GABA channel, the inhibited neurotransmitter. So which means thalamus will be inhibited or excited, that particular area of the thalamus, if you stimulate it with GABA.
Should be inhibited.
Inhibited. So if you inhibit thalamus, then this signal going from the thalamus to the cortex, okay? So if you inhibit the thalamus, so thalamus, this response from thalamus, excitatory signal from thalamus to cerebral cortex will be inhibited, will not be there. So let me draw something. Take your time, okay? So now, if this part keeps firing continuously, so this GABA will be released, right? So this GABA will be released. Now, if that GABA is released here, so that will inhibit the thalamus. So this connection from thalamus to the cerebral cortex will be terminated, right? Did you get that much? Did I mix things up? No. Okay. Let's do it one more time. So, like globus pallidus is normally what happens? Thalamus stimulate the cerebral cortex and relate the signal from the basal ganglia, right? Thalamus stimulate the basal ganglia, the cerebral cortex to do some to release the motor function. But if you inhibit that particular area of the thalamus by releasing GABA from the what happened to my this one is not good. Into this one. Okay. So if you keep releasing GABA here, that particular area of the thalamus will be inhibited. Is that much clear? Okay, good. So normally we say thalamus will stimulate the cerebral cortex and tell the cerebral cortex that I got the sequence of events, I got the programming, so now execute the function. That normally, when we want to do a motor response, that is what the thalamus will do, right? Now, if you inhibit the thalamus, this excitatory signal from thalamus to the cerebral cortex to communicate the response, to communicate the signal of the basal ganglia will be absent, right? If that is absent, cerebral cortex will remain quiet, which means we are at rest. That's why I am saying while we are at rest, the globus pallidus internal segment will continuously fire. And if it continuously fires, what it will release? It will release GABA. GABA will inhibit thalamus. So this excitatory, see, the dotted lines are inhibitory and the solid lines are excitatory, okay? So which means thalamocortical connection is excitatory. Now, you are inhibiting the thalamus, so this excitatory connection from thalamus to cerebral cortex is absent. If that is absent, cerebral cortex will not execute any motor function, so our all muscles will be at rest. That is what normally happens. We say normally, under normal circumstances, globus pallidus internal segment will remain active. Now, when the cerebral cortex want to perform a motor function, okay? So it received the signal from premotor area. So it plan to do a motor action and very specific motor action. What it will do, cerebral cortex will send this information, this intention of the cerebral cortex that I want to write something. That signal will come from the from cerebral cortex to the basal ganglia. Which part of basal ganglia the signal will come? The signal will come to the striatum. Okay. So what type of neurotransmitter will be released at the cerebrostriatal junction? It will be glutamate. So glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter. Okay. So if glutamate is released here, so what will be the response in striatum? Striatum will be inhibited or striatum will be excited? Inhibited or excited? If you release glutamate.
Excited.
Good. So if striatum is excited, what striatum will release? Striatum will release GABA on the striatum globus pallidus junction. Now, GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, right? Is that clear? Okay. Now, if you release GABA on the globus pallidus, striatum globus pallidus junction, what will happen to globus pallidus nuclei? They will be inhibited or they will be excited?
Inhibited.
Good, because of GABA, right? It is inhibited. Normally, we said under normal condition, this is excited, so it releases GABA here. Now, if you can inhibit globus pallidus by the secretion of GABA from the striatum, so do you think this GABA will be released from globus pallidus into thalamus? Because if you inhibit globus pallidus doesn't produce any action potential. It either doesn't produce any action potential or it rather produce hyperpolarization, because GABA will either it may open the potassium channel. It will not open sodium channel. Rather, if it doesn't open sodium channel, it will not cause any action potential. but rather it can open the potassium channel. Now, if the potassium channel is open in the globus pallidus, what will happen? It will be hyperpolarized. So, which means, do you expect when the globus pallidus will be hyperpolarized, do you expect any signal to travel from the globus pallidus to thalamus? No, because it's hyperpolarized, no action potential there. So if there is no action potential here, do you expect this GABA to be released here? No. If you don't release GABA here, normally we say GABA is released, so hypothalamus remains suppressed. Now, if you don't release, if you can stop the release of GABA here, what will be the status of hypothalamus? It will come out of the normal inhibitory effect of GABA coming from globus pallidus internal, right? So if you can block this GABA here, which means indirectly you are withdrawing the inhibition on the thalamus. So now thalamus will send this signal to the cortex, telling cortex to execute its motor function. Number one, so cortex will start sending signal. Now, how much signal it will send, which muscle to signal, and that will be computed by the globus pallidus, and that signal will travel from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex as well. So did I even complicate the things even more, or was it helpful?
That makes a lot more sense.
Okay, good. Well, that's what. But you see, when you by yourself you start looking at the connections, at the beginning you may get confused. So how come this doing this? Because these are all stimulating. You are stimulating globus pallidus, really, right? But by stimulating by globus pallidus, you are inhibiting globus pallidus because your stimulation is with GABA. And here also, globus pallidus to thalamus connection is also GABA. Okay, so you have to, here the key is who is connected to what and what type of neurotransmitter is released in the response. Now, you see, if you just make one small mistake here, you say cerebral cortex to striatum is GABA. If you say that, so cerebral cortex will cause the inhibition of the striatum, right? So if the striatum get inhibitory response, which means normally the GABA that is coming here, that will continue to come. That will not come. If the GABA doesn't come, which means this one will be stimulated, and this normally that what happened, and then GABA will be released on thalamus, and it will inhibit the thalamus. Okay, so that's why I wanted, because I know this circuit is a bit complicated, not complicated, just you draw your own circuit and see what happens when you stimulate which part of that in that circuit. Okay, I think that will make things a little bit. You draw your own thing. If you make a mistake in your neurotransmitter, of course you will find completely different result. But if you can draw the connections right, and if you can write the proper neurotransmitter, I don't think it will be anything complicated for you guys. Okay. Now, and once you understand that, then we can talk about, so like, what are the main basic pathways? We say one is nigrostrial, right? Look at this one. This is the substantia nigra, and it is going to the striatum, right? So we call it nigrostriatal dopaminergic system, right? Look at this one again. If we go back, this is substantia nigra. We said nigrostrial, right? This one, which means this one, nigrostrial. What type of system is it? It releases dopamine. So we say nigrostrial dopaminergic system. Now, remember, dopamine can do both. It can do excitation, it can do inhibition. If the dopamine stimulates the D1 receptor, that will cause excitation. If it stimulates D2 receptors, it can cause inhibition. At this point, just look at the pathways. Now, intrastrial cholinergic system. Within the striatum itself has two components, right? Now, within themselves, they secrete acetylcholine. So that system is cholinergic. You don't have to get on that one. But this one is important, GABAergic system, which is striatum to globus pallidus and substantia nigra. Look at this one. Striatum to globus pallidus internum, okay, and striatum to substantia nigra, and striatum to globus pallidus externum. So if you, as they are going to both globus pallidum externum and globus pallidus internum, you can say striatum to GABA, striatum to globus pallidus, and that system is GABA because it releases GABA on both ends. Okay, and striatonigral fibers are also GABAergic. You see the GABA here that is released from striatum. That is the pathway from the striatum to the substantia nigra. So this, even though I mentioned three, just remember two main ones. One is nigrostrial dopaminergic system and GABAergic system, which is striatum to globus pallidus, both externum and internum, and striatum to substantia nigra. Okay. So this could be now the main diseases that you see of the basal ganglia are the most important one is the Parkinson's disease. Okay, and in Parkinson's disease, what is the problem? The problem is in substantia nigra. Substantia nigra has neurons, they secrete dopamine. Now, if those dopaminergic response receptors are damaged, dopamine secreting neurons are damaged, then you will have less dopamine in the system, then you develop the Parkinson's disease, and you will see those people who are suffering from Parkinson's disease, they are treated with dopamine. See, there is a combination we call levodopa carbidopa combination. It's a very popular drug, and then you give patient those, but this is complicated situation. When you treat them with dopa, they have other problem as well. And now some of the people, they get antipsychotic drug. Okay, there are some antipsychotic drugs which contain dopamine in them. Now you will see you are treating someone for his or her the psychotic problem, and you end up improving the psychotic problem, but you end up getting the Parkinson's disease because of you inhibit the dopamine. So now damage to the dopamine secreting neuron and inhibiting the dopaminergic response is nearly the same. The end result is the same, and then you can develop drug-induced Parkinson's disease. And the chorea is another disease where there is one called, it's a Huntington disease basically, but there are different type of choreas. Choreas are unintended jerky movements. You will see some people they do like this, or move their head. Sometimes those movements can be very painful for them. So those are called chorea. And one of the very common, important one is called Huntington's chorea, which is very common one. Okay, this is a genetic disease actually, because of the genetic problem. So I don't want to go into any more detail today. Actually, on the next class will be next Tuesday, right? So next Tuesday, my main focus will be cerebellum. But before cerebellum, I will begin with the basal ganglia and see how much. You see, I don't expect you to understand all the circuitry very clearly, because if you ask me to explain one more time, I may mix up the things. So don't feel bad if it gives you some trouble. It still gives me trouble. Actually, if I go through all this, so this one is releasing glutamate, so this will be stimulated. So in response, this will secrete GABA. So GABA will inhibit that one. If it inhibits that one, what will be the response? If it withdraw the inhibition, what will be the response? These things still confuse me. So don't feel bad if things are a bit confusing at the beginning, but I can tell you, just draw a simple circuit. Just think of from which area of the brain is the basal ganglia receiving signal. It will receive signal from two different areas. One is the cerebral cortex, the other one is from the thalamus. And what is the output from the basal ganglia coming? The output from the basal ganglia will coming mainly from the globus pallidus internal segment, or it may come from the substantia nigra, right? Nigro. So do you have any question on this? And actually, I don't expect too much question in this, but I will expect a lot of question next day when we begin with a quick review of the basal ganglia. If you really go into study, I can tell you that you will be confused by some of the things that I say, and then eventually you will figure out. This is not something very too difficult. Just think, just be careful. Draw some circuitry by yourself. See which neurotransmitter is released in that segment, and then that will make things clear for you. Okay. So if you guys are all okay, I can stop the meeting here today, and then we will meet next Tuesday. Okay. Sorry for any. So, did you have any internet issues during this class? Okay, good. I was pretty nervous actually, but this is pretty hot here actually. I cannot. For some reason the air conditioner is not working. If I use the fan, the ceiling. We have. I don't know whether you are even familiar with the ceiling fans. We have ceiling fans here, and then if I use them, they make quite some noise actually. I'm feeling pretty hot actually out here. Anyway, so I think that's where I want to stop today's thing. Let me stop sharing the screen. And if you don't have any more any question, then let me stop this one here. Are you? Is it okay? Okay. Thank you. Be safe. And it to the actually as soon as I left the I as I was leaving, I drove when I was leaving my neighborhood. I was driving right just on snow. Actually, it was very scary when I drove Saturday very early in the morning. But now the week I came back, the weekend was very good, and the week next week was very good. In terms of temperature, I mean. Okay, thank you so much for joining. I will see. I will try to see if I can modify, convert this recording. If I cannot do it, I will do it as soon as I get back to United States. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.